In the quiet, unassuming town of Branson, Missouri, there was an old man named Frank Miller whose eyes held the weight of countless unspoken tales. Known to the locals as Old Frank, he was the kind of man whose weathered face and gruff voice belied a past filled with stories that seemed almost too extraordinary to be real. Frank had served as a soldier in some of the most dangerous combat zones of the world, and though he rarely spoke about it, the scars he bore were more than just physical. It was a late autumn evening when Frank decided it was time to share one of those dark, unsettling experiences he had kept locked away for so many years. The air outside was crisp and carried a hint of the approaching winter, and inside Frank's modest, dimly lit home, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The room was filled with a few curious faces, including that of a local journalist who had managed to persuade Frank to recount his tale for the first time. Frank settled into his favorite armchair, the one with the worn leather that seemed to have absorbed years of his anxious fidgeting. He took a long, slow drag from his pipe, the smoke curling lazily around him as he stared into the flickering light of the fireplace. The young listeners, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, leaned in closer. "Back in Nam," Frank began, his voice gravelly with age but steady. "I was stationed in a place called Firebase Ripcord. It was one of those remote outposts in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense jungle and a constant sense of dread. We were there to hold the line, but what we ended up facing was something far beyond the scope of any military briefing." He paused, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps trying to silence the echoes of those haunting memories that seemed to linger in the shadows of his mind. The fire crackled softly, punctuating the silence with its occasional pops. "You see," Frank continued, leaning forward slightly, "it wasn't just the enemy we had to worry about. Sometimes, out in the dark, there were things that shouldn't be there, things that defied explanation. And it wasn't just the paranoia or the jungle's natural sounds that were creeping into our minds. There were nights when we could hear whispers, voices coming from the blackness, and shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't." The room was still, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the old house and the soft rustle of Frank's pipe smoke. His audience sat in rapt attention, the tension palpable. Frank took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, the smoke mingling with the shadows of his story. "It wasn't until the night we went out on patrol that things started to get really strange," he said, his eyes narrowing as if seeing the scene play out once more. "What we saw out there, well, it made us question everything we thought we knew about fear and the unknown." As Frank's voice trailed off, the room seemed to grow colder, the flickering flames of the fireplace casting eerie shadows on the walls. The young listeners felt a shiver run down their spines, a sense of unease growing with every passing moment. Frank's story was just beginning, and it was clear that the horrors he was about to reveal were far from over. Frank took a long sip from his mug of lukewarm coffee, his eyes distant as he seemed to drift back in time. His audience was completely silent, hanging on to every word. The room was now almost too quiet, save for the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Firebase Ripcord was like a fortress surrounded by endless, oppressive jungle, Frank continued. It was a place where the lines between sanity and madness blurred. We were always on edge, knowing that the enemy was out there, waiting for a chance to strike. But as the days turned into weeks, we began to realize that our fears were not just about the Viet Cong. He leaned back, adjusting his position in the armchair, the old springs groaning under his weight. One night, around midnight, we were on patrol. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the jungle was a suffocating darkness. The only light we had came from our flashlights, cutting narrow beams through the blackness. We were on high alert, listening for every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Frank's voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if he feared speaking too loudly would bring back the horrors. We started hearing something, a sort of low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. At first, we thought it was just the jungle playing tricks on us, but it grew louder and more distinct. It was like a deep, primal growl mixed with whispers that seemed to come from the very heart of the darkness. He paused, allowing the suspense to build before continuing. We followed the sound to a clearing. The air was thick and damp, and the ground was eerily quiet under our boots. That's when we saw it. At first, it looked like a mass of shadows, almost like a living, writhing fog. But as our eyes adjusted, we saw shapes, vague, twisted forms that seemed to move with a malevolent intent. The young listeners shivered, their imaginations racing as they pictured the scene Frank was describing. The room seemed colder, and the light from the fireplace flickered more erratically. We couldn't make out what those shapes were, but they seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, Frank said, his eyes narrowing as if trying to push away the fog of memory. It was like they were trying to communicate something, but whatever it was beyond our understanding. We tried to get closer, but as soon as we stepped into the clearing, everything changed. He took a deep breath, the memory visibly affecting him. The growls and whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then we saw them, figures emerging from the darkness. They were like us in some ways, but twisted and malformed, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They seemed to be watching us, but there was no sign of aggression, just an eerie, dispassionate curiosity. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he continued. Our radios went dead, and we couldn't get any signal. We were completely cut off. And that's when we realized that the real horror wasn't just what we were seeing, but what was happening inside our own heads. The shadows seemed to get inside our minds, making us question our sanity. We started seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that had no source. He leaned forward, his face shadowed by the light of the fire. Some of the men began to break down, screaming about things that none of us could see. Others just shut down, sitting in a trance-like state. We tried to regroup and get back to base, but the jungle itself seemed to turn against us, closing in with a malevolent force. Frank's gaze was distant, as if reliving every moment. Eventually, we made it back to Firebase Ripcord, but we were changed, haunted. We had been touched by something beyond the ordinary, something that made us question everything we had ever known about fear, the supernatural, and the limits of human endurance. He looked around the room, meeting the wide eyes of his listeners. To this day, none of us who were there can fully explain what we saw or what happened to us. We were left with more questions than answers, and the experience became a dark secret we carried with us. And while I can't give you all the answers, I can tell you this: some things are better left unexplored, and some fears are best faced with the understanding that not all things are meant to be understood. The fire crackled softly, and the room was filled with an uneasy silence. Frank's story was a chilling reminder of the thin line between reality and the unknown, and as the young listeners processed the haunting tale, they couldn't shake the feeling that some shadows are better left undisturbed. Frank took another sip from his mug, his hands now steady, but his eyes still reflecting the torment of his memories. The room was still, the audience hanging on to every word, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace. After that night, Frank said, his voice taking on a softer, almost melancholic tone, things at Firebase Ripcord never went back to normal. The whispers continued, and the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of our vision. We tried to make sense of it, but no matter what we did, we couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed us back. He paused, his gaze drifting to a small, weathered box sitting on a shelf across the room. It was an old wooden box with intricate carvings covered in dust. Frank's eyes lingered on it, a faint, troubled expression crossing his face. It was after we left Ripcord that the real mystery began, Frank continued, his voice lowering as if confiding a deep secret. I was discharged soon after, but the experiences we had endured didn't end when we left Vietnam. Some of the men who had been with me started disappearing. One by one, they went missing under strange circumstances, sometimes without a trace, sometimes leaving behind unsettling clues. Frank's face grew darker as he spoke. One of the guys, a friend named Jake, was found in his home, sitting in a trance, muttering about the shadows and the voices. When the authorities arrived, they found no signs of struggle or disturbance, just Jake, completely unresponsive. He was taken away, and we never heard from him again. The audience was silent, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Frank's story was taking on an even more ominous tone. He took a deep breath, continuing, "I tried to find answers, but every lead led to dead ends. The government was no help, and anyone I spoke to dismissed my claims as war trauma. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it." Frank leaned in closer, his eyes locking with those of his listeners. "The thing is, a few years ago I received a package. It was that very box," he said, nodding toward the dusty wooden box. Inside was an old photograph of our firebase, taken from a perspective I never remembered seeing. And in that photograph, there were figures, shadowy, indistinct forms moving among the trees, just like what we saw in the clearing. He opened the box slowly, revealing a collection of old military memorabilia, some faded photographs, and a journal. He picked up the journal and handed it to the journalist, who had been documenting the story. This journal belonged to one of the men who disappeared. It's filled with notes, sketches, and incoherent ramblings about shadows and whispers, much like what we experienced. Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. "But here's the thing that I've never told anyone. The last entry in that journal is a chilling message. It says, 'They are watching and they are waiting. The darkness is alive and it will never let us go.'" The room fell into an uneasy silence. The journal was passed around, its pages revealing scribbled notes and unsettling drawings. Frank continued, "I don't know what happened to those men or what we encountered out there. I've come to believe that there are things in this world, ancient, malevolent forces, that exist just beyond the edge of our understanding, and sometimes they reach out to touch us, to remind us of the thin veil separating our reality from the unknown." Frank stood up, his eyes still haunted by the shadows of his past. "I've lived with these memories for decades, and now I'm passing them on. Maybe it's a warning, or maybe it's just to share the burden. Whatever the case, remember this. Some doors, once opened, are not so easily closed, and some shadows, once glimpsed, are never fully left behind." As Frank finished his tale, the firelight danced in the room, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. The audience sat in stunned silence, grappling with the chilling account they had just heard. The haunting tale of Firebase Ripcord was now a part of their reality, a chilling reminder that some mysteries might remain forever unsolved, lurking just beyond the fringes of human comprehension.